Hello. Okay, let's get started. We've got pretty modest amount of people. There's that number, it's ticking up. We like to see that participant number ticking up. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Wellness Wednesday. This is a virtual series for those of you who are new to this. This is something that occurs monthly. It's brought to you by the editors at Mpls.St.Paul magazine, and it's in partnership with Northwestern Health Sciences University. They are the sponsor of this series. I'm Jamie Korf. I'm your moderator for today. And alongside all of you, I will be exploring a fascinating developing topic as we tap the brilliant mind of a local brain health specialist. So before we get into the granular, just want to let you guys know about Northwestern Health Sciences University. They're based out of Bloomington, and they offer an array of degree programs and natural healthcare education. They are leaders in holistic health. They offer services to the public at their Bloomington clinic that's on site. And they have career tracks that are rooted in acupuncture, chiropractic care, traditional Chinese medicine, and naturopathic medicine, and so much more. Whoops, there goes my computer. The university also has an on-site lab. And they boast the largest herbal dispensary. Now my computer positioning is all messed up, sorry. Where was I? They have an on-site lab and they have the largest herbal dispensary in the Midwest, which differentiates them as the best among most of the rest. So every month, we, as a Mpls.St.Paul magazine, partner with the experts at Northwestern, and we produce a couple of digital posts, and those are centered on hot topics and emerging research in natural health and integrative health. We have covered the basics, and we talk about things that are really up and coming and emerging. We recently covered how patients with long haul COVID are using a combination therapy of ancient tools like traditional Chinese medicine to treat some of their most dubious symptoms to, modest or great success. And then not long before then, we uncovered how this is something that we can all relate to, how chronic or long-term stress or even PTSD can cause the plasticity of the brain to structurally reshape itself to handle all the strain. And so brain health isn't something that's been traditionally covered by our editors and the experts at Northwestern. And that particular post that I just referenced performed really, really well, which meant that there was so much more untapped potential in the neuroscience realm. So with that, we would like to follow that up with another hot issue in brain science, and that's exploring the link between movement, specifically physical movement, and brain wellness. For a really long time, the scientific community said that we all arrive to a certain point where our brains just stop growing. But meanwhile, we could pick up new languages, we could learn new hobbies. And so that right there demonstrated that there was room for growth. So Michael Hennis, he's a doctor of chiropractic at Northwestern Health Sciences University. He has seen the pendulum swing when it comes to brain talk. And he's here today to talk about the ways in which we can create new neurons, AKA brain cells, for a lifetime through unexpected ways. Dr. Mike is a chiropractor who specializes in functional neurology. He treats brain injuries, concussions, migraine disorders, stroke, and so much more. So with that, go ahead and turn your camera on, Dr. Mike.
Only if I have to.
Yeah. You gotta. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's such a treat to have you here, Mike, Dr. Mike. And before we jump in, I was actually just talking to Mike about this. He specializes in functional neurology, and I thought maybe as kind of a good primer or a lead up to our discussion today, he could talk a little bit about what specifically functional neurology, what that means?
Absolutely. So neurology is basically the study of our nervous system. And medical neurology, we're looking at being very good at diagnosing things or finding things like a stroke or a tumor or penetrating injury to the skull, that sort of thing, and figuring out where that problem is or how it's breaking down. But once we found it, our options are kind of limited. If it's a stroke, we obviously have to stop the bleeding or let the clot move, or we have to do some surgical repairs, that sort of thing. But if we're looking at how well the brain actually works, we kind of drop the ball. We don't have a lot to offer in that realm. And that's where functional neurology comes in. It's very much like rehabbing or doing therapy on a sprained ankle, but for your brain. So what can we do to get that brain back to working the way it should? And a concussion is a perfect example of this. If you get an MRI after a concussion, you're not going to see any problems on there, more than likely. Unless it's really bad, you might see some late stage changes or something like that. But by and large, your imaging is going to come back clear. And so this is why for a long time, we actually thought people with concussion symptoms were faking it. Well, we know that's not the case. We thought this, 20, 30 years ago, but we know that's not the case anymore. And so my job and what got me really interested in this realm was figuring out what can I do physically to the body to help improve brain health, right? How does a physical medicine realm of healthcare like chiropractic, how can I apply that to neurological health? And that just kind of led to a rabbit hole, and here we are.
Thanks, Mike. That's perfect. Let's start from the top, unless you have any questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to dive right in. Okay. Actually, one more thing. If anybody has any questions throughout the course of this discussion, feel free to chime in at any point. We're not, saving everything until the last 15 minutes. I mean, just put it out there. No question is a dumb question. I mean, I know I have a brain. I don't know a lot about it. So let's just put it all out there. Your questions can go in the Q&A or it can go in the chat. And in the chat, I believe, is where everyone can see your comments or your questions. So Dr. Mike, I was talking about, and you had mentioned this to me, that there was this long held belief in the science community that our brains just like stop developing. And basically what that means is that they stop producing new neurons. Is that correct? And can you also share why these scientists subscribe to that notion for such a long time?
Sure. So we have two different parts to our nervous system. We have our brain and our spinal cord, and that's considered central nervous system. And then we have everything else that once it leaves your spine, everything else after that is peripheral. Okay. That's an important distinction because the peripheral nervous system, we know, regenerates itself. It actually regenerates really quickly at the lightning speed of about 10 millimeters to 20 millimeters a month. I mean, if we're really cooking, that's as fast as it goes. But in the world of cellular regeneration, that's fast. In the central nervous system, until relatively recently, we're talking 50s here, we thought that they couldn't repair themselves. And they do. They just do it so slowly that for all intent and purposes, we say the CNS or the central nervous system can't repair itself. We don't really build new cells, but if you injure them, can we actually regrow those neurons? And the answer is yes, but maybe not at a meaningful rate, okay? It still goes relatively quickly. I think it was, I forget the number now, but something like 10 millimeters a month again. But the problem is, if it doesn't connect to the exact same spot in the exact same pattern, which is impossible, you're not going to do things like get memories back or get motor control back the way you did. You're going to have to do some relearning. And in the case of memory, it's never probably going to come back. So it's kind of a semantics problem where there is some regrowth, but it's not fast enough to actually mean anything. So for all intent and purposes, we say it doesn't regrow. Now, that's not to say that we can't make new connections, okay? So if I have a group of neurons and I teach them all to intermingle and create this big web with one another, that's a completely different scenario. We've not created new neurons, but we've taught them to talk to one another again. And that's really the basis of my work and my clinical approach to working on some of these brain injuries is how do I promote those connections? How do I promote the connections we want to see for different behaviors? Maybe that's moving your eyes around so you don't get dizzy, or letting you incorporate the muscles and joint information from the rest of your body to tell you you're not moving. Okay. You ever closed your eyes and felt like your car sick? Well, that shouldn't happen. Why are you relying so heavily on that visual information when you have so many other senses telling you you're not moving? And so my job then is to figure out, how do we get all of those different neurons to connect again in the right patterns by doing different physical things, which we'll talk about a little bit more.
I don't want to go kind of, too off topic here, but what came to mind was, I guess I'll get kind of personal here, but a cousin of mine, she's experienced a severe TBI about, I guess it's been almost 20 years ago. I think it was 2003. And I was there for her recovery in, the first 3 to 6 months. I mean, I wasn't there daily by any means, but I would do a lot of check-ins with family and stuff. And it was just so fascinating to me how, I mean, she was literally, her brain, it was bad. I'm not going to get into specifics, but she was relearning things. And it was almost like I saw her relive her life from childhood to adolescence to being an adult again. And I was just wondering if, so that's not creating new neurons, right, Dr. Mike? That's the promotion of the connections between them that's happening.
For the most part, and it depends on the age. If you get really young kids, sometimes we can see some regrowth, or
Sure.
more like infiltration, where you always talk about, if you lose one sense, the other senses take over. Well, that's plastic change. It's you're kind of reorganizing your brain. So the younger you are, I think and I'm a little hazy on the details, so please don't send me to the mob if I say this wrong, but I think there's a little bit more regrowth the younger you are. Obviously, we as adults don't have that so much, but
Got it. And she was 18 when that all went down.
Yeah.
Okay, that helps us kind of setting the foundation for what we're going to talk about today. And so that kind of leads into the next question here, Dr. Mike, and that's, you don't have to be specific, but when that notion was overturned in the scientific community, I mean, that was still quite some time ago, right?
Yeah. So it's more of I would say, a semantic or frame shift in the way we were thinking. We stopped looking at the only way we learn new things is by growing new neurons. And we started to realize that we could organize the way those neurons connected. And the coined term is Hebbian theory, or neurons that fire together, wire together. And this was proposed by a neuropsychologist in the late 40s, early 50s, named Donald Hebb. And his idea was, if you have two neurons that talk to one another and they do it a lot, that connection is going to get stronger. And so if we look at something like learning a language, if you have to sit down and read a language, you might be able to read a language really well. But if you never listen to it, you're never going to develop that connection to the sounds and the phonetics, but you can probably understand the grammatical structure. If you only listen to it on the radio and read it, but you never open your mouth and try and rehearse the words, you're never going to incorporate that motor center of your language, and you're not going to be able to speak the language. If you're doing all three, like you move to Spain and don't speak a lick of Spanish, you give it a couple months, you're going to be pretty decent at Spanish if you're trying. If you're not trying and just try and speak English everywhere, you're not going to get very far. And so the shift was more that we were looking at how well those neurons connect and what can we do to drive those different processes, more so than say, well, we can't grow new neurons, so there's nothing that can change. We just looked at it in a different way. What can we do to promote those different connections and learn new things? Really is all we're doing. In my world, we're looking at retraining movement patterns and retraining how well your eyes move and how well you're interpreting information. But that's really no different than burning through hundreds of flashcards like you did in high school or college to get through that test. It's just a different senses, but the process in your brain is largely the same. Neurons talking to one another.
So let's talk about exercise or physical movement. And that's one of those things that can promote those connections. It's not, it's flashcards, it's learning new languages, it's that, and it's also physical, like I said, physical movement. Can you just give us sort of the layman explanation for how repeated movement, it doesn't necessarily have to be exercise, but repeated movement kind of helps to maintain or to increase those connections in our neural pathways?
Sure. So if I go back to that language analogy, you've got all of the different senses that you use to interpret your world, right? Your brain is like a big computer. If it's not getting information, it can't make decisions. But once it gets that information, it has to process it, make a decision, and then tell your body to do something, right? Nothing happens until something moves. That movement might be a sound, it might be a thought, it might be a vibration, it might be a touch, it might be hot, it might be cold, it might be taste. But all of those things are just information coming into our brain. And so the best way to learn something is to incorporate as many senses into it as you can. Now, if you're a construction worker, I wouldn't recommend you go out and start licking concrete to get a taste sensation out of it. But the premise holds. If you study something and then you learn to do it, and then you have to go teach someone to do it, you're now using different aspects of that neurology of your brain, of your memories, to go through and teach something. So how does exercise play into this? If you're studying, we always hear that you should study for a little bit and then go to bed and let that solidify into memory. If you study for a little bit and then go work out and move your body around, you actually started to incorporate that physical movement. You've incorporated a physical part or the movement parts of your brain with the cognitive parts, okay? The part of your brain that makes you also coordinates to some degree your amount of movement, okay? So your personality, your memories, your higher reasoning skills, the part that makes us human, is in the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe also tells us to move. So if you're trying to move a bunch of weights around, or you go out running, or you're kayaking, or whatever, you've started to actually incorporate all of those different parts together. So if you happen to be a student or have students, one of the best things you can do is have them study and then get them out and take them to baseball or softball practice or something like that. Student athletes as a whole tend to do better because they are working on their academics and working on the physical side of things as well. There's also the argument to be said that they can't develop bad habits if they're at softball practice, but the neurology stands to say that we're also using different senses involved. So we're incorporating that stuff just as well. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. And I'm mad that I'm learning this like 20 years after I graduated high school.
I didn't learn it until graduate school.
I'm an athlete, but not really. I was more of like a play geek. And
it's the same process though. You might not be exerting yourself in the, can I bench press 300
I was good at remembering my lines.
Right. You have to move the lines. You still have stage movements and everything like that. You have to memorize. It's still a physical, especially when you're a little kid. What do? You sing and you dance and you jump around, and you have to have these repeated movements, and you rehearse, and the director says, do it this way, not that way. And you have to remember that take to take to take, day to day.
Right.
It's the same process. You're just, maybe not trying to cut down on your 40 time or something like that.
So are you saying that physical movement is considered a form of mental stimulation, right?
To some degree, yes, especially if we go back to the theater example, there's probably a little bit more thought involved. If an athlete starts thinking, they're probably going to start dropping in performance to some degree. You have to start relying on procedural memory, which is, I've done this so many times, I do it without thinking about it. Okay. So
muscle memory kind of stuff.
Yeah, muscle memory type stuff. So like if I'm working with patients and they have, we'll say, simple neck pain, we're not working on any fancy concussion stuff or anything like that. When I go to actually adjust their neck, I stop thinking about it and I just go with what I feel and what I feel needs to move. If I think too much, the adjustment probably doesn't go so well because I'm in my head about it. I'm in their head about it instead of just, this is what's here, this is what needs to be fixed. Athletes tend to do the same thing. You think too much, what do? You drop the ball.
Dr. Mike, I don't know how I feel about a chiropractor working on my neck and not thinking about it.
Maybe that's not the right way to put it, but.
No, I know. I'm just giving you a hard time. I totally get what you mean. I do. I mean, it's you said it's procedural. It's something that you do consistently.
Right. We see this in people with amnesia all the time. They pick something up and they they know how to do it, but they have no idea why. They might not know their name, but suddenly they can speak French again. Well, they went to a French immersion school when they were a little kid. They haven't spoken it for 40 years, but their French came back, right?
Right.
It's rare, but it happens. And it's all that procedural muscle memory type memories that we lock away and don't necessarily access, but it's in there.
Sure. And that's why we see those headlines about, people with dementia that hear a song and they can just pick up. I mean, I think Tony Bennett is actually pretty vocal about how he has Alzheimer's and he forgets everything. And then once the music starts, he's a completely different person. He's who he was 30, 40, 50 years ago. So
music and smells are really powerful for that, because they fire so heavily into a part of the brain called the limbic system, which triggers emotional types of memories and just brings you back. It just, smell in particular fires so deeply, so centrally into the brain that it actually bypasses the brainstem to some degree. And it's amazing what you can do with smell. So back to the student analogy, if you can get like I always used peppermint oil when I was studying, and then I'd put some on my hand while I was taking tests. I don't know if it helped me out or not, but the theory was sound.
Yeah, I mean, it can't hurt.
Sure can't hurt. There was I shouldn't say that. There's actually research to say something like sucking on lemon drops while you're studying and taking the test, or chewing gum, again, because it just incorporates that other sense.
Sure. Wow.
Don't ask me what the studies are, but I know I've read them. I'm terrible with names and dates and all of that stuff.
Yeah. So okay, so the physical movement, the incorporating all the sensories. So say that I'm training for a half marathon. So I sort of have an obligation to be on the pavement, so many days a week for so many minutes at a time. Am I going to just by kind of as a byproduct of that, am I going to be like, when I go to bed and I read a few pages of my book at night, am I going to be better at remembering what happened in the chapter previous? I'm trying to just kind of like distill this into sort of like a day-to-day example.
Sure. So one of the things exercise does is it increases this chemical in your body called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. And we don't exactly know how it does this, but what it does is it acts like fertilizer for your brain. So neurons, they have this axon at one end and a dendrite at the other. Dendrites have information coming in, the axon sends information out. Okay. What brain-derived neurotrophic factor does is it forces arborization, which is a fancy word to say it promotes branching like a tree. Okay. You get this big tree that branches out all over the place. That's what we're talking about. And so by exercising, you're promoting all of that branching of the neurons. That branching promotes different connections. So by exercising regularly, you're going to get more release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and you're going to better be able to build these connections. So if you have bad habits, you might actually enforce the bad habit. If you're reading or studying, you should have a better time remembering those things. There's still going to be some repetition involved, right? If you're reading for the sake of falling asleep and you're not really into what you're reading, you're probably not going to remember a whole heck of a lot of it. But if you really like reading, like I just finished reading Shoe Dog. It's an autobiography written by Phil Knight, the guy that started Nike, and I couldn't put it down. It's not a terribly exciting book. It's a biography of someone that started a big company, but I found it fascinating, and I remember a lot about that book. The book I read before that, I can't even tell you the name of it because it wasn't that exciting to me. So some of that's going to play into it as well, but exercising regularly is just going to put your brain in that space to have better neural connections. Okay. It's also going to do things for your brain like improve lymphatic flow, like lymphatic flow in the brain, we call it. But that's essentially taking the garbage of all your normal metabolic processes, right? Cells, just like our bodies, have waste products that they create from doing their job. If you don't get rid of those, they get stuck in the brain. Okay. Exercise promotes that movement. You have to sleep to get that out of there, but exercise helps promote those things as well. So exercise is really one of the easiest and cheapest ways to promote brain health. Why? Because you need a pair of running shoes, or not even walking is shown to be great for for this as well. All you have to do is get your heart rate up a little bit. We like to see movement of those lower extremity or leg muscles, specifically the glutes, because they're so big. They're big, powerful muscles that are made to hold our body weight up. And they fire into the brain so powerfully. So this is why squats or deadlifts or stuff like that is partially such a core exercise for everything, because they activate these different muscles so powerfully.
Right. Okay. And there was a question from one of our registrants, and that was, they were wanting to know, so there's somebody who practices yoga, I think weekly. Are they going to be seeing any results? Are they going to get that BDNF effect?
Yep.
Because they're
So,
not, it's more, I mean, I guess all over, yoga is kind of a whole body practice, but it's not, pounding your feet to the pavement and working those power muscles that you were just referencing.
Yeah, so yoga always gets a bad rap, I think, in the exercise world, because is it exercise? Is it stretching? And I think people say that. People that work out a lot, move a lot of heavy weights, or runners, they tend to say that about yoga. And then people that do yoga challenge their runner friend to do it, and the runner falls over in 5 minutes.
Yep.
So anybody that says yoga isn't exercise hasn't done much yoga. It's a different kind of activation. So yoga done properly is a very active process. There's nothing passive about it. You are in tune with your breathing. You are physically holding yourself in these, I'm going to say, compromising positions. That's not the right way to put it, but they're very active. You can't just balance on one leg and expect it to be there. You have to physically use your muscles to do that. So the activation is different, right? If you're running, you have this rhythmic pounding as you pound the pavement, quite literally, and that's going to release certain chemicals in the body. Now, yoga, on the other hand, is a slow, controlled, holding type motion, but you still get all of this muscle activation firing very powerfully into the brain, but you also get a lot of core central activation. So these central structures of the brain, which we always use the analogy in the clinic of building a house. Okay, we all live up on the third floor. Okay, our frontal lobes, where we have all the walk-in closet, the fancy bathroom, the home automation, the dimming lights, the in-home theater, all of that cool stuff is up on the third floor. Okay, but all the plumbing, the electrical, the foundation of the house is really where all the important stuff is. Okay, it's really nice to have all the fancy things, but if your drains aren't working, if your water doesn't turn on, if your heat doesn't work, all of that stuff, if the foundation of the house is cracked, none of it matters. Okay, central structures or core muscles, all of that stuff is like the foundation of the house. You have to work on that for everything else to work appropriately, and yoga does that really well. We actually recommend yoga to patients a lot. Yoga, Tai Chi, Pilates, all of this core-based work, partially because there's a lot less dynamic movement involved. So if someone with a concussion, most people with concussions have eye movement issues. If I tell them to go out and run, their world starts bouncing around. It's very difficult for them. Okay, they have trouble sitting still, moving their eyes around, much less if I tell them to start running 3 miles a day. Yoga presents us with a unique opportunity to activate these muscles, be very active, get your heart rate up, because you're going to get hot, let alone if you're doing something like hot yoga. But it works on balance, it works on core, it works on muscle activation. So we get the same effect, even though we're activating the brain and the muscles in a different manner.
Got it. So the same could be said for a plank. The same could be said for a session at the boxing gym.
Yep, and you're going to get little nuances of difference, because obviously if you're doing a plank, you're not moving. If you're running, you are moving. If you're doing something like yoga, you're getting into these positions and holding it. Whereas if you are boxing, you've got a lot of dynamic moving, jumping around, and it's just different. It's not, but the basic neurological effects are the same.
Got it. For kind of more of the isometric type of stuff versus like the hyperactive stuff.
Right.
Okay.
And the more coordination that goes into something, we say you've got a little bit more cerebellar involvement. Well, yoga, there's not necessarily a lot of coordination in the aspect of trying to land that baseball in your glove, but you have to be able to slowly lengthen one muscle while contracting the other one so that you don't fall over. So there's just as much coordination involved, but also in order to keep those muscles from shaking, they have to contract at the same rate. So we still have, even though there's not as much movement, a fair amount of coordination involved in those
Got it.
less complex movements, if you will.
Dr. Mike, one of our attendees, has a question for you. And she said that you had mentioned that just getting your heart rate up and doing modest exercise activates neurons. So does that mean that more intense and high endurance exercise equal to an even greater benefit? Does 2 to 3 hours of cycling, swimming, running offer more branching of neurons than a 20-minute walk? It's a really good question.
Jennifer, that is a great question. And the really quick answer is too much of a good thing becomes no longer a good thing. So it depends on the person, right? I can't take someone fresh off an injury and tell them to go cycle 3 hours a day because their body just can't handle it. Their neurons can't handle it. Okay. Neurons are just like muscles. If you haven't used them in a while or they don't have the endurance, you can't push them beyond what they're able to do. Okay. I think most people have experienced this, whether you work out or not. But if you go to the gym for the first time in a long time, you feel pretty good about it. You're excited about it. You work out really hard and you feel hungover for like 3 days. Okay. Some of that is inflammatory changes in your muscles. Some of that is muscle soreness. Some of it's your brain not being able to handle that much activation at a time. Okay. So there's going to be a threshold, and the more you work out, you might need to extend your workouts to get the same effect. But then we can cheat. And there were a couple of programs in the early 2000s that came out, P90X, Insanity, all of these things. Well, what did they work on? Muscle confusion, they called it. Okay. Well, that's great. But all you're doing is moving different muscle groups in different ways. So by changing up your workout, you can get the same effect in smaller amounts of time. Okay. What we need to do is we need to push you beyond a comfort zone. Okay. So if you're talking about aerobic exercise, that's when we start monitoring your heart rate. Are you getting into that threshold? Are you, if you're weightlifting, are you meeting your weightlifting goals? That sort of thing. So getting more exercise isn't necessarily going to give you better branching. It's more about doing the exercise on a regular basis. Okay. It doesn't take much. 20 minutes of walking a day is sufficient to get everything moving. So doing, 2-3 hours of cycling, swimming, running isn't necessarily going to give you more than walking on a regular basis, I guess, is the really long-winded way of saying.
So there's not a discernible difference in the organization of those neural pathways from a walk to the grocery store versus a triathlon kind of a thing.
Right. I would argue you need to do a 20 to 30 minute walk. Parking at the back end of the grocery store and walking in across the parking lot isn't probably going to be enough to do it. But if you walk around the block, that's going to take you 10-15 minutes. We need to have a little bit of sustained activation to get these changes.
Got it. So are you also saying, Dr. Mike, that somebody who I guess engages in pretty intense activity, whether it's their training or they're a professional athlete or they just really like to exercise, are they erring on that whole brain overworking situation you were talking about before? Even if it's consistent for them. I mean, I don't know how sustainable a couple of hours of exercise is a day every day, but then again, I do have friends that do that. So
right. And if you're getting paid to play, there is a certain amount of mental resilience that has to come into it as well. And so a lot of the longer workouts, they become as much of a meditative practice as they do an actual physical practice. Okay. So if you look at, I've recently started following F1, and you get these drivers, what do? They sit there and play video games on their day off. What are they doing? They're playing a racing video game. They're not learning how to drive better. They've already learned how to do that. It's can they stay focused on that video game for an hour at a time because, something weird happens in a race. They have to keep their mental clarity on it. So professional athletes going to be doing the same thing. They have to work out that much to keep themselves in physical condition, but they also have to ingrain, like we were talking about, some of those movement patterns so that if something strange does pop up. They don't have to think about it, right? What's Bill Belichick is quoted as saying, trust the process. Okay, we don't care about winning the game. We're going to go through our process. If we win the game, that's a byproduct, but it's not our goal. Our goal is to go through our process and do it as religiously as we can and do it right. And the byproduct of that is winning. And so professional athletes, they end up doing the same thing. They practice over and over and over again because they need the physicality of being able to do their job, whatever sport or whatever that is, but then also to have the mental clarity and the focus to be able to do those things for that long. If you or I tried to go through their workout, one, our bodies would probably give up way before theirs would, but we're not going to have the neurological capacity to do that either. Our brains are amazing, but we're not going to have the fuel delivery systems. We're not going to have the waste management systems. We're not going to have that neurological endurance to be able to put up with it. So to say, are they erring on the danger of crashing their brain? A professional athlete, probably not. You or I, if we jumped into it right away, probably, right?
Okay. I have a question for you, Dr. Mike, and that is, okay, so say that, so we were all, pretty sedentary, especially like in the early stages of the pandemic, because we just didn't understand the disease. We didn't know how contagious it was. Anyways, all that to say that I also got pregnant and had a baby. And so I haven't been my most active. I mean, I carry around a 35-pound child. That's like my exercise and taking
They get really heavy real quick, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah. And what I was going to ask you is, when he gets to a point where he is a little bit more independent and I can take an hour for myself a few times a week and work on my fitness, am I going to know that my brain is changed? Like if I'm consistent with it, and I'm accountable with myself, am I going to notice some sort of change in how I think? I know that sounds dumb. Just
it's a good question, and it's a
better
tough
organizing information or just remembering details. Like, how am I going to know? I mean, I'm not going to arrive to a day where I'm be like, aha, I have all the answers. I know all the things. I know that that's not realistic, but I hope that you can kind of pick up what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and it's a really fascinating question and a really hard one to answer, and even a harder one to measure, because like you said, there's not going to be an aha moment.
Right.
Okay? If you journal, you would probably be able to look back through your journal entries and notice a shift in the trend of your writing to yourself.
Got it.
Or, our job is to learn, right? The meaning of life is learning how to learn the meaning of life, right? No one really knows what it is, but it's basically to ponder that question as we go. But there's so many other habits that come into it, right? If you go work out, but your workout consists of sitting on an exercise bike at a gym, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with, but you're scrolling Instagram the whole time. All right, you've got good stuff coming in, you've got garbage coming in from the other direction. So that's going to kind of offset. If you are, I've with the warm weather, I've taken my son, who is a little bit younger than I don't even remember what you had.
He's
when we talked about the
year and a half year old.
Yeah, so we've started to take him out, but I'll put a earbud in and I listen to podcasts now instead of scrolling Instagram or cell phone games or whatever you used to do to kill time in the pandemic, because you couldn't do anything else. So some of it just comes from giving yourself other challenges, right? So like I'm listening to aviation podcasts. I don't fly, I'm not a pilot. It's just something totally outside of the realm of my comfort zone. That it gives me a different frame of reference to look at it.
Got it.
But again, if I'm not applying that information, how much is it actually going to change me? Because it doesn't, learning about airspace doesn't mean anything to me.
Sure. But it's like what you were saying earlier with, that book that you were reading and how, it was so fascinating to you. And then you think back on the book before and you couldn't remember a lick of it. I think that there's something to be said about what you were saying, like how invested you are in the material, whether it's a book or a podcast or however you take in your information, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, cool. This is so cool. Where are the questions, people? This is so cool. Okay, sorry, I had to have
I know I'm not that well spoken.
Oh, chat. Let's see here. One thing I noticed that you might too. Oh, so this is Jennifer. As a follow-up to what she was asking about before, Jamie, one thing I noticed that you might too, as you ramp up exercise again, is a mental sharpness and focus that I feel immediately after exercise. That's so true. My most productive work hours are always right after I work out. Yeah, those are really, really good points, Jen. And I always feel like $1,000,000, after like sweating through the worst of it, with the endorphins that take hold and everything else, all those, that chemical release you were talking about, Dr. Mike.
Yeah. You might regret the workout
Yeah.
because of the soreness, but I don't know that anybody's ever upset with themselves for going to the gym. You're upset with yourself for not going, but you're
Exactly.
never upset about going.
Dr. Mike, can we talk a little bit more about, so we know that exercise, and especially as you incorporate other senses, is, linked to a stronger cognitive function, but what are some other things that it does, or maybe the things that kind of layer into all of that happening? Like, we know that running helps with reducing inflammation. You were talking about getting rid of the bad stuff. Um, it allegedly lowers levels of cortisol, right? The stress hormone. Can you talk about some other things that it does? Just
Sure. So if we take the running example, right, everyone's heard the term runner's high. Well, what's a runner's high is you release these endorphins and enkephalins, and that's based on actually the rate at which you're hitting the pavement. Okay. So we run at a certain frequency, right? You're taking so many steps per second. And that actually forces you to release this opioid that your body makes naturally called endorphins. Okay. It makes you feel good. If you are a runner and you don't run for a couple of days, what happens? You're a grouch. No one wants to be around you because you haven't gotten your fix, right? Now, the problem, and you can get addicted to exercise. We see it all the time in patients as we tell them, look, you're working out too much. And people are like, well, what do you mean I'm working out too much? It's good for me. Well, too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing. Okay. So as much as working out helps us improve lymphatic flow and helping get rid of the bad stuff and helps us move all of our garbage around, if you're working out too much and you're just getting injured, well, now you start to create more inflammation. So it can become a problem that way.
Yeah.
There's also some research out there working on it's actually a chemical dependency drug. I'm not going to talk too much about it. This is another book that I had to put down because it was just so deep into the weeds that I just couldn't do it to myself till I finished the book. So I'm reading another book in between. But it's basically an opioid agonist, which means it attaches itself to the opioid receptors on our cells, and it does all sorts of wonderful things for our brain. Now, I'm not saying opioids are a good thing, but we do make some naturally, and you can kind of think of it like biohacking, and we're using it at way smaller than what's considered a therapeutic dose. I shouldn't say I'm not doing it. I refer out for it because I can't use medications. But we see this in people that have autoimmune diseases getting some improvement with it. Depression, anxiety, brain injuries have some grounds in this as well. So it's a little off the top of exercise, but so getting back to it, endorphins are going to end up doing the same thing, right? We activate these opioid receptors, and that stimulates all of these really good therapeutic processes within our body. We're designed to have these chemical messengers floating around. And so if we have a pandemic and we sit on the couch and watch Netflix and don't remember any of it and don't move, we're not creating any of these chemical processes, and our cortical or our neurological resistance goes down, and we get crabby and short fused and have no patience, and all of the things we see happening right now. And so we're all very happy that we can get outside. Right. And be social distance if you want to, or if you don't, then we have restrictions that say we can go do that now. And right. Exactly. All of this stuff is great for your brain and your neurology.
Yeah. This is all so fascinating, Dr. Mike. I'm so happy that we could do this. And I'm so happy that we could nab you for this. Because we've talked about so many things, but we just really haven't zeroed in on brain health. And, it does have these connections, no pun intended, with, it's not just a Western medicine thing, with chiropractic and all of that. there are some Eastern medicine ties there. I think a lot of people that are just unaware of the benefits of integrative medicine just don't understand how cutting edge it is and can be, especially through like the practice of something like Cairo. Lisa wants to know, and this is a really good question before we go too far away from what we were just talking about, Dr. Mike. She says, do you retain more if you take in the information? So you're reading the book or you're studying for the test, or you're listening to the podcast while you're exercising, or is it just the same if you consume that information before or after you exercise?
I will be really honest. I don't know the specific answer to that, although I suspect that it's going to be different per person.
Okay.
So I had a classmate while I was in school here. He didn't work out a lot. I'm not throwing him under the bus or anything like that. But come finals week, so after our classes were done, and then you have that cumulative final and you're trying to brush up all that information, he would study for 2 hours, then go to the gym for an hour. Then he'd study for 2 hours and go to the gym for an hour. It's the only time he worked out. He was also a valedictorian. So if that tells you anything. Working out beforehand is going to create brain-derived neurotrophic factor and make it so that your neurons are more able to create those connections. But working out afterwards is also going to do the same thing. So if you're like me, you sit down and you study something and then you go work out. If you don't have music or anything else going on to distract you, you're going to have all that information running through your head again. So you're essentially relearning what you just taught yourself. And now you've got the physical motion coming in. So I don't know specifically, but you can make a case for either one of them, and you'll just have to figure out which one works for you.
Okay.
And if you're working out on a regular basis, it doesn't really matter because you're going to have that BDNF in your system already. It's going to be floating around. So
BDNF is that fertilizer for the brain.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And Lisa Norby also wants to know if exercise can help. So we were talking about, stronger cognitive function. We talked about, the opioid, like chemical sensories and all that. Can exercise help slow the progression of diseases like dementia?
All right, you're going to see me get really politically correct on this answer. And the short answer is we can't stop dementia and we can't prevent it. Well, I shouldn't say we can't prevent it from happening. There's a great study out of 2014. Dale Bredesen wrote it. There was a follow-up in 2018. I can't think of the name of the study now. It's going to come to me right after we get off the webinar here. But anyway, he came up with 27 or some odd different factors that lead to dementia and Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. And at the time, he was kind of laughed at for it because, oh, this is a terrible study. You can't possibly tell us there's 27 different factors or variables that go into this. When you do a study, you have to study one thing. And he kind of laughed and said, well, you clearly don't understand Alzheimer's. So exercise is one factor to that. By promoting more cortex connection or having those neurons be more deeply connected, you're going to give yourself a better chance of avoiding those things. If the process has already started, you can try and pull a 180 on it and slow it down to some degree by working on these things. But if you've lost memories, you're not going to get them back. Why? Because it's impossible to have those neurons reconnect in the exact same way with the same intensity. Okay. And that's all memories really are, is this super complex interconnected web of the pattern of the way the neurons fire. And we're never going to get that back because the scenario is never going to be the same again. Our brains are never going to be the same again. We are all different people from the time we started this webinar because we've had questions asked to us. We've had answers, hopefully correctly given by me, and we've all thought about different things. So our brains have now changed because we've created new connections. Okay. So if you ask me the same question you did at the beginning, my answer might very well be different. And that's a tough pill to swallow sometimes. But we're a different person than we were yesterday. So by working out, you can absolutely help those things. But actually, one of the best things we have patients basically start a meditative practice. Every new patient gets breathing exercises. We don't necessarily tell them it's meditation because people think we're a little woo-woo when we do that. But what we find is after 6 to 8 weeks, we can actually increase the thickness of the thinking part of your brain, the cortex part of your brain. And what that means is those connections are getting stronger. The more connections you have, the more connections you can lose before it starts to become a problem, is the really easy way to think about that. So exercise is just another layer to that. The more you use the neurons, the more resilient they're going to be to change, whether that's good change or, well, more resilient to the bad changes of things like dementia, Lewy bodies, Alzheimer's, CTE, all of that stuff.
So just so that I'm certain, once a memory is gone, it can never be recovered, or it can be recovered, but in sort of a different incarnation.
You might get pieces of it just because of how complex the webs are. But once a memory is gone, you're probably not going to get it back. And this is different than, say, an amnesia, where that's more of a functional change. In dementia, we're usually looking at plaquing or some physical change to the brain where the connections are being interrupted. Not necessarily the neurons are damaged because they got stretched or pulled or compressed, and they're just not quite doing their job. They're still there in something like an amnesia, but in a dementia or an Alzheimer's or CTE, where we get all this thinning, the neurons are actually damaged and they're just, maybe they snapped or whatever. The process is different. So before someone jumps on me for saying you don't get memories back, Alzheimer's and dementias are different than the functional amnesia problems.
Got it. Okay. Lisa says, like Jennifer, I feel great physically, more alert and energized after exercise, and I do more productive creative work after exercise. But I also feel a sense of accomplishment when I manage to motivate myself to exercise, and that seems to boost my mood. So true.
Here's that study I just talked about. I threw it up in the chat for everybody.
Is that from Dale?
Yeah.
Okay. And it looks like we found a link to, I don't know, foundmyfitness.com/episodes. Is that like a podcast? Okay. And we have another attendee who says, sorry if this was touched on already, but is there anything around the most effective time of day to exercise to promote retention? So morning versus night to be most effective.
This is a huge argument in fitness circles. And when do you want to work out? And unless you are getting paid to play, the answer is whenever you're going to do it. Whenever you're going to stick to it is the best time to work out. Okay. I used to work out. I used to go to the gym at 2 a.m. I was a night owl in school. That's what I did.
So whatever you're wired
to. And then you don't sleep, and your morning classes don't go so well sometimes. So that habit had to change really fast. But that's when I would go. That's when I would work out. If you are a morning person, I am not. So I'm not going to be the guy to get up at 4 a.m. and go for a run. I work out now after my son goes to bed. Why? Because it's the time I can do it.
Got it.
There's some research to say your cortisol spikes in the morning, which it should. That's why you wake up. And your blood flow is highest at, I believe, mid-morning, 10:30, 11 o'clock, something like that. But in a different group of people, it might be completely different. So there is a best time. There's a good amount of research on it. I don't know what the research says, because in the practical world, the best time to work out is the time you'll do it. If you have a job that will let you do it and you can do yoga over your lunch break, that might be very good for you because the gym's across the street. If you're like me, I don't have time to do that. And so I work out after he goes to bed. It's bright enough now at 7 o'clock that I can go out for a run. But basically we're splitting hairs. When the best time to work out is the time you'll do it.
Okay.
Would you get better effects at it at certain times of the day? Yes, probably. But a lesser effect is better than no effect.
So if you're somebody who's wired to be more productive in the evening hours, like you were saying, maybe not 2 a.m., but something like 7 or 8 p.m., and then you try to force yourself to be a morning person and to, sort of design your day around the morning walk or the morning run, is that going to have, what am I trying to say? Release more cortisol because you're kind of going against your, like the way that your tendencies are ingrained, or maybe you will see a bump in cortisol, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Are you talking? I'm sorry, someone's doing some work outside of the office, so I lost it a little bit. Are you saying if you work out, if you're trying to force yourself to be a morning person, are you going to release more cortisol, or did I get that?
Yeah, and And maybe it's only temporary, but is that going to be
Sure.
kind of counterproductive? Is that going to affect your performance? Is that going to have some sort of mental implications for you?
There's probably going to be mental implications, because if you're not a morning person, you force yourself to get up, you're just going to be crabby all morning. But no, and it's basically teaching yourself a new habit, right? I'm not a morning person, but I actually prefer to get up and get to work early. I prefer to see patients earlier in the day than later in the day. I prefer to get up and have important tasks done in the morning. So that works well for me. And then I work out later in the day. But you can teach yourself to have new habits. Okay. So we're getting into cortisol cycles and circadian rhythms here, but your cortisol goes up in the morning. That's what wakes you up, because your blood sugar drops because you've been fasting all night long. Okay. Conversely, as the day goes on, your cortisol drops, but your melatonin goes up. Okay. Your melatonin should peak at sundown, which means it's time to go to bed. That's why you get tired. If you manage to push through that, you probably get a second cortisol spike, which isn't fantastic sometimes. Okay. If you're not managing your blood sugar appropriately, what do? You wake up at 2, 3, 4 in the morning and you're bolt awake and you have no idea why. And you have trouble falling back asleep because your cortisol is high. So if you can manage to get yourself up early and work out, and then put yourself on a sleep schedule that allows you to get a good 7 to 8, 9 hours of sleep, whatever you need to sleep and wake up without an alarm clock, you can reset those patterns to be an appropriate length. And then you'll become a morning person, but it's going to be a real rough 2, 3, 4 weeks to do it. So you're not hurting yourself by doing it, but there's way more that goes into becoming a morning workout person than just getting up and working out, right? You have to rearrange your entire biological clock, basically.
Your life.
Yeah.
But when you have a kid, the kid just kind of does it for you. So that's always helpful. But
a
reason to have a kid.
I've been giving some serious thought to becoming the 4 a.m. workout guy, and I just can't bring myself to go to bed at 8.
Don't try it. I've tried it. Don't do it. It's just not worth it. And you know what? I actually ended up more tired. Like, exercise has a tendency to make me feel energized.
Yeah.
That early, it's just like unlawful. Okay, so it is almost 1 o'clock exactly. I think we have all of our questions answered. Dr. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. This was probably like the most fascinating brain melting session I've been a part of. Seriously, like I have so many thoughts in my brain right now. I need to write them down.
That just means we have to do it again sometime.
We have to do it again. Yes. And anytime that, there's some sort of a development or there's some type of emerging research in brain health, feel free to bump that my way. Maybe we can cover it in a future Be Well post.
Absolutely.
So thanks again for your time, Dr. Mike. We really appreciate having you on our Wellness Wednesday. For the rest of you, next month, Wellness Wednesday is always the third Wednesday of the month. Next month is Headaches Aren't Normal, and Here's Why. And that's going to be on June 15th. It's always the same time, 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. So make sure to mark your calendar. We're going to have Dr. Brad Feiner on for that one. And he is like a headache/migraine genius. And for those of you who may have missed a part of it, you can always go back on our YouTube page, youtube.com/MSPmag, and you'll find the archive of all of our Wellness Wednesday videos to date. Thank you everyone so much, and have a wonderful week. Keep up the great work. You're doing great.
Have a good one, everybody.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye.